So my name's Christopher Hurd, and I am going to be in conversation, as you know, with Margaret Renn, who's just written a book about the journalist Paul Foot. If you're expecting data journalism, that's another room. So that's, as you know. Paul was an extremely good friend of mine, and we worked together on 3 television projects. And indeed, I was also the editor of the deputy editor of the New Statesman when he worked for the New Statesman, wrote a column for the New Statesman. If you, depending how much work you've done to find out who Paul is, he wrote for an enormously wide range of publications: the London Review of Books, the Guardian, the New Statesman, Socialist Worker, Private Eye, and the Daily Mirror, and particularly the Daily Mirror and Private Eye for a long time and a continuing basis. And that's probably through those 2 publications that most people at the time read his material and heard of him. But he was also something of a public figure as well. He was frequently on the radio and frequently on television on a program called What the Papers Say, which ran for about 50 years on ITV, and also on Question Time, a program which is still running on British television. So I thought, for those of you who had never met the man or knew him, we would just show you sort of 4 minutes of film that I've put together from his public appearances. And for those of you who did know him, it's a very happy reminder of what an amazingly entertaining person he was. So if you press the button now, we should be able to see it on this screen here.
Now that's what I think we should investigate.
Up to now we've had people convicted of things that they didn't do. Now we've got someone convicted of something that didn't happen.
This poem, The Revolt of Islam, is really effectively, through all its many, many pages, a hymn to women's liberation. The ability of working people to control their lives, a glimmer of that, in reality, not in some kind of rhetoric, not just in somebody saying it, but really happening. Wherever anybody's rising up, wants to do something, get off their backsides and fight the society, people have shouted, "Rise like lions," and read Shelley and been inspired about it.
This government and the Centre for Policy Studies, which is exactly the same thing, are quite entirely hostile to anyone who goes to a state school, because only 90% of the population go there.
The racialism that exists in the police force is something much deeper than that, and something which would have to be dealt with in any sensible society in a much more drastic way.
Well, I must say, listening to these Tories, it makes you instinctively want to side with poor old Jack here, but I'm not going to do that.
Paul Foot.
Well, I was listening to the Admiral there. I was remembering the famous song of Sir Joseph Porter in HMS Pinafore. I think it was Porter, not Norton. And it was something about, I always answered to my party's call, and I never thought of thinking for myself at all. I thought so little they rewarded me by making me the ruler of the Queen's Navy. Remember that?
The whole of the 20th century, there have been Labour governments elected trying to do things on promises which they haven't carried out.
Hold on, Mr. Governor. I'd like Mr. Foot to have his answer first, because he doesn't always get a word in.
No, I never get a word in. You look at the world totally, and you see that if there was 1% of defence expenditure put into, for instance, agriculture, you would have enough farming equipment to start to end all the hunger in the world. That's the nature of the world we live in. Now, the greatest cause of all is to match that production
to match that ability to produce with the needs of people, which I believe that the system which these gentlemen represent here does exactly the opposite, because it's greed that motivates as he admits, Mr. Goldsmith's people. Greed motivates him. The rich get richer, the poor poorer.
We've got time for one more good question, I think. Mr. Fife, who is the marketing executive. Mr. Fife?
Does the panel look forward to the prospect of Ronald Reagan becoming president of the United States?
I think the amazing thing about American politics as we see them in the presidential race is how they manage to choose from all the people that are available to them. I mean, 200 million people available to them, all sorts of brilliant legal people and people of workers of every description, and they choose these cardboard cutout figures, strange people from Western movies, sort of down-market Walter Goldsmiths, to become their president. You have sort of, first of all, Nixon, and now Reagan, unimaginably lunatic and reactionary figures. I mean, people who presumably would press the button because they felt like it one day, rather than leaving an expletive undeleted. I mean, the whole thing is absolutely horrible. I regard it as absolutely horrible, and I don't know how they choose these people.
Now, the book that Margaret has written is on sale outside. It hasn't actually been published yet, so buy your copies now. She'll probably sign it for you if you want. And I'm assuming that there's quite a few of you here who haven't read that book. So I think it's a good place to start with perhaps just a brief overview, well, as long as you like, really, overview of sort of Paul's life. I mean, that's one thing I just would say ahead of this, that it's really unusual for a biography to be written about a journalist. Lots of journalists write their own memoirs, and there's plenty of those, but actually there's a very, very small number of journalists whose achievement is so great that there is a book and a biography written about them. So just give us sort of a bit of an overview of his life and career, and then we will move on to it in more detail.
Okay, I'm going to try without the mic, but I might resort to the mic. So can you hear at the back? Is that all right? So there's a few... One of the things about Paul, he's a bit of a bundle of contradictions. So this is the sort of short version of a whole book. He was born in Palestine. He was born in Haifa because his father was a colonial civil servant. And I use that word colonial with meaning because this was days of empire. This was before the Second World War. And then for the first few years of his life, he moved around the world with incredible speed as his father was moved around from pillar to post. He came from a family of lawyers and politicians. His grandfather, Isaac Foote, had been the Liberal MP in Bodmin in Cornwall and was a lawyer. His various uncles, some of whom you may have heard of, Dingle Foote was a lawyer and a Liberal politician until he couldn't get elected as a Liberal politician, then became a Labour politician. His uncle John was a Liberal peer, and his other uncle, Michael Foote, was a Labour MP. And the two things that you need to know about Michael Foote and about Paul's grandfather, Isaac Foote, was that they were bibliophiles. These guys read books and bought books like no tomorrow, and Paul was in that tradition in his family. At the age of 8, he ended up in Jamaica and spent 2 years at school, primary school in Jamaica. And from then on, he was a committed anti-racist and totally in love with cricket and West Indian cricket in particular. And his brother Oliver was born in Jamaica and always referred to himself as a Jamaican. He then got sent to 2 very posh public schools back home in the UK. Did 2 years national service. Rishi Sunak, please note, Paul Foote thought it was a complete and utter waste of his time. But he had the good fortune to go back to Jamaica for one of those years, served in the Jamaican regiment, and watched an awful lot of cricket. And he then went to Oxford, and he met at Oxford Richard Ingram's, who he had been at school with. And at school there had been Richard Ingram's, Willie Rushton, Christopher Booker, and these were the people who went on to found Private Eye. But after university, Paul took a different route. He decided he was going to become a trainee journalist, and he got sent off to a provincial newspaper, the Daily Record up in Glasgow, very large provincial newspaper, with a working class audience. And Paul absolutely loved it. And while in Glasgow, within weeks of arriving in Glasgow, he met up with people who were in the Labour Party Young Socialists. And his interest in politics, which he'd always had, then translated. He became engaged with the political arguments. This is 1962, so quite a while ago. And he joined an organisation called the International Socialists, which became the Socialist Workers' Party. And he stayed a member of the Socialist Workers' Party until he died in 2004. And he was always an active socialist. He couldn't see the point in calling yourself a socialist unless you were an active socialist. He returns to London in 1965, and then he begins on this trajectory of first of all, newspapers, then Private Eye. Then he goes to work on Socialist Worker for 6 years, on a salary so small nobody could survive on it. And at the end of that, extraordinary. So he had some very successful stories. He did some very successful stories on Private Eye. His mentor on Private Eye was not so much his friend Richard Ingrams, who was the editor, but Claude Coburn. And Claude taught him one or two things. Always listen to the loons was one of Claude's suggestions. So that when I worked with Paul on the Daily Mirror, and we got green ink letters from readers. And Paul would always take those as seriously as any other letter. But he did quite a number of very serious, because when he went full-time to work on Private Eye in 1967, he sort of got these pages at the back, and they're still there. These were the sort of serious pages of Private Eye. And he wrote stories. I tell some of the stories in the book, but so he did a whole series of articles about the heart surgeon, the sort of breakthrough heart surgeon, Christian Barnard, in South Africa. And Paul asked a very fundamental question. You know, are the people whose hearts he's transplanting, who are ostensibly dead, he said, are they actually dead? And he based that on a lot of information he was getting from journalists in South Africa. He started writing about Jeffrey Archer, that well-known pathological liar, and pursued him for his whole political journalism, Archer's whole political career and Paul's whole journalistic career. He wrote his first sort of serious political scalp was Reginald Maudling, the Home Secretary, who was utterly corrupt. And he and Mike Gillard exposed all his corruption. So he was doing those sorts of stories. Then he moves to Socialist Worker, and he's doing very different stories. I mean, he still does investigations when he can, but really on Socialist Worker, he's writing about workers in struggle. I mean, there's only one or two people in this room who will remember 1968 to 1974, but they were very exciting political years in this country, and Paul was tempted to put his politics into practice by going to work on SW. And he literally toured the country, writing about workers in struggle, talking to shop stewards, talking to trade unionists, because there were so many strikes and so many upheavals at that time. Then he had a brief period on the New Statesman writing a column, because he left Socialist Worker in some sort of political dispute in 1978. And then in 1979, Margaret Thatcher was elected, and the whole terrain of British politics changed, and we're still suffering from that sort of the tail end of that era, perhaps, we don't know. And he got a call from the Daily Mirror. He said, will you come and work for us? And he said, well, not really, no. He was fishing a bit. Anyway, they offered him a column, his own column. And the thing about Paul's column, and he wrote it for 13 years, I worked on it for 11 of those years, was that it was not an opinion column. This was not Paul going on about something or another. Every single story he wrote was a story. And each column, in general, 9 times out of 10, each column would have 4, 5, 6 articles in it. So we got very, very good at writing articles that were no more than 450 words. Quite difficult some of the time. I mean, sometimes the columns were 100 words. Sometimes he devoted the whole page to a topic. And he kept that up. But at the same time, he was still writing pieces for Private Eye. So when I wrote this biography, so you get a sense of how prolific he was. I was trying to work out how many columns he probably wrote in 13 years. I got up to 1,000 columns in Private Eye, in the Daily Mirror. And then when he got kicked out of he left the Daily Mirror when Maxwell died. Maxwell had taken ownership of the Mirror Group. He died. There was a year without a proprietor, and then the banks brought in, and the board brought in David Montgomery, who just came in and slashed all the union jobs. Anybody who was in the union got sacked and got cut out. So we all lost our jobs, and Paul left in disgust and went back to the Eye, and then wrote, until 2004 in the Eye, and from then also until 2004 in the Guardian. So his output was absolutely prolific. And when I had started writing this book, I thought, oh my God, how am I going to do this? So I might just take a couple of examples of the sort of stories he did in the Mirror. So I've got a couple of, one prompt which I brought for a completely different reason. I just happened to have them with me. So this was his page. He had this, it's not on this one. He had a line at the bottom of the page which read, if there's anything you think I should investigate, write to me at the Daily Mirror. And he thinks it was the first time that any column had put out that appeal. And we had, Paul would get dozens, hundreds of letters. And he had a phone line, and the paper gave the number of the phone line, and we got hundreds of phone calls. Paul ended up with 2 secretaries because the volume of letters and the volume of phone calls was so enormous. There was no coping with it unless he had that sort of support. And so he would get all sorts of very, very ordinary stories from readers of the Daily Mirror, just really asking for help. And this particular one was one that I helped him with. I did the research on this, of a young man who was suffering from severe schizophrenia. His parents couldn't cope, and he desperately needed a place in a mental hospital. And this is 1990, this is when that Tory government's cuts had been gathering pace, and the whole process of shutting down the mental institutions and the policy of community care, which really meant no care, was in place. And we did this story about this young man suffering from extreme form of schizophrenia, couldn't get a place in a secure mental institution. And so he would, on various occasions, either try to kill himself or he would steal. And he'd steal so he could get a place, he could be sent to prison. And he was always in the hope that if you're in one institution, you get passed on to another institution. And in the end, the whole outcome of that story was absolutely tragic. But that story began because that boy's father wrote to the Mirror, wrote to Paul at the Mirror saying, please help. By contrast, when Paul first arrived at the Mirror, the 4 men had just been convicted of murdering the newspaper boy Carl Bridgewater. And this became one of these very famous miscarriage cases. And from 1980 till 1998, 18 years, Paul fought for justice for those 4 guys. Pat Malloy died in prison, but Michael and Vincent Hickey and Jimmy Robinson were finally released in 1998. And Paul calculated that he wrote 30 articles in the Mirror on that one case. And although, and Christo will understand this, when he used to go down to the subs desk or to the editor's office, they'd say, oh, watch out, not you again, not this story again. Oh, watch out, any newspaper boys around, you know. And they would just rib him for doing this story again and again. But at the same time, the Mirror put up £7,000, which in 1981 or 2, whenever it was a lot of money, to buy the trial transcript. And by having the trial transcript, Paul could go through and read what was actually said at the trial, as opposed to what was said in the statements. And this is where Paul had the most fantastic forensic brain. He was absolutely useless at anything technical. Tape recorder, fax machine. I mean, he could just about use a typewriter with 2 fingers. He couldn't do shorthand. He'd have been absolutely hopeless today with data. Oh my God. But then, he did have this incredibly forensic brain. So he compared the trial transcript to what was said in the statements. And I'll give you one example. He picked out this half a sentence that Michael Hickey gave in his evidence. It's not in his statement, it's in his evidence. He had an alibi. He was with his cousin during this murder, buying a second-hand car at a garage in Birmingham. And at the trial, he says there was a fat Greek in the office of the garage. And Paul went with Michael Hickey's mother. They tracked down the owner of the garage, who was a Cypriot. And indeed, his father-in-law, Mr. Sokolades, was rather stout. And the lawyer, Jim Nichol, who worked with Paul, flew to Cyprus and found Mr. Sokolades and got his passport and showed, because he didn't live in Birmingham, he came and went, and showed that on that particular day, he was indeed in the Bristol Road garage in Birmingham, and he proved by all the financial documents that that was the time that Michael and Vincent were in the garage buying a car.
And therefore could not have shot
and therefore
the
couldn't have been involved in the murder. This all came out at the first trial, the first appeal, sorry, and the judges just ignored it. And they said, well, there's bits and pieces. Well, they said that might prove his, you know, but there were other bits and pieces which showed that Michael was involved. And this is the other thing about Paul that I wanted to say. We went back to the office after that appeal was lost, and everybody was in a state of despair. I mean, people were crying. It was absolutely awful. The entire legal team, some of the top legal minds in this country, just could not believe that these judges had said they were guilty and upheld the conviction. And Paul, optimist as ever, said, all right, something will turn up. And a year later, something did. And then eventually in 1998, they were proved, their convictions were quashed. So he could keep these stories going. His sheer optimism would see him through. And I think I should stop speaking for a moment.
You can keep on as long as you like. But there are a couple of things there that you mentioned, which I think is worth picking up on, because you haven't mentioned the key point about the freedom that he had at the Mirror, and that, what he wrote would always be published. And that was the deal that he secured when he took the job.
Yeah.
So that this was a completely protected space within the paper.
Yeah. I think he was enormously respected by the editor who recruited him, Mike Malloy. And Paul would say, you know, what editors really want are people people with ideas, and, you know, people who can come forward with stories. He gave an interview once in which he described one features editor saying to him, you know, there's nothing worse than going into a features editorial meeting and seeing all these journalists staring at you, wanting you to tell them what they've got to do. They want people who come with stories. And Paul was always full of stories, and he had enormous respect from both Mike Malloy and Richard Stott, who followed him, and Roy Greenslade, who was there for a short period. And his space was protected. Now, it wasn't just a free-for-all. Paul couldn't just churn out whatever he wanted. it had to go through the Mirror lawyers, and they were fantastic. I mean, you want people who understood libel law. Hugh Corrie, you know, I mean, Hugh Corrie once offered Jim Nichol a drink at 12 o'clock in the morning. Jim had gone to discuss something or another, and
Hugh Corrie being the head lawyer at the
yes, the libel lawyer at the Mirror. Hugh said, "Would you like a gin and tonic?" Jim said, "Hugh, it's 12 o'clock. I won't get through the afternoon if I start drinking now." And Hugh said, "I won't get through the afternoon until I do, unless I do." Anyway, the point is, I'll give you one example. So Paul is contacted by a woman called Florence Siddons. Her granddaughter, Lynn Siddons, had been murdered, and her stepfather and stepbrother had been convicted, had been charged with the murder. Somehow or another, the stepfather was knocked out of the story because the stepbrother, who was only 14, confessed to the murder. But he got off at trial. Nobody, you know, by the time of the trial, his lawyers had, you know, sorted him out, and he said, no, I didn't do it. My father-in-law did it, and my father did it. Lynn's stepfather. And Florence Siddons came to Paul with this story, and Paul was, you know, tried to explain that if you accuse someone of murder, it's a very serious libel. And, you know, it was impossible to, anyway, eventually he sorts out how to do the story, and he goes through it, both with Richard Stott and Hugh Corrie, the libel lawyer, and they get it so neatly, you know, so watertight, and they take it to the managing editor of the Mirror, who almost has a nervous breakdown and says, "You can't publish this. Yeah, no way." And the point Paul made about Tony Miles was, he said, the thing is, he was a newspaper man, and so they sat there and they explained step by step by step, sentence by sentence, why the article was watertight, and they published it, which again shows the respect the Mirror had for Paul, and nothing happened. The police said nothing. The man they'd accused, Michael Brooks, of the murder, nothing. And it took another 16 years before Michael Brooks was convicted of that murder. And so, you know, Paul had a lot of respect, he had a lot of freedom, but that didn't make it easy. He had to work. And that is the other thing I wanted to say about Paul. There are various aspects of Paul as a person it's worth knowing. He had a prodigious memory. You tell him something this week and he'll remind you of it 5 years later. I mean, it was incredible. He just had a memory for facts and details. He wrote, Christo might have something to say about his television appearances and making television documentaries with Paul. But Paul was really a words journalist. That's where his strengths lay. And he wrote with incredible ease. You know, I have the story in the book because his son, Tom, who's a journalist on the Camden New Journal, says on Saturday evenings, when Paul was writing his Guardian column, he had to write. Guardian wasn't like the Mirror column. The Guardian was often stories of the day or his thoughts, you know, his thoughts about stories from his past, or there are some really good stories in there. But usually he was commenting on something political or something that had happened or something he'd heard about. And he said, Paul, we'd be just settling down for Match of the Day, and Paul would say, "Oh, I've got to do my Guardian column." Go upstairs, bang out 800 words, absolutely to the number, and come down half an hour later, column all done. And it makes it sound incredibly easy, but I know from working with Paul that these stories were running in his head all the time. I mean, I'm surprised. I mean, you know, how old was he when he died? 66. Yeah. You know, it's sort of from over. I mean, his brain was going all the time, and his brain was churning over the stories. What am I going to write? So by the time he sat down to write his Guardian column, it was all there. He knew exactly what he was going to say, and he just had to, you know, type it out with 2 fingers. I remember when we were on the Mirror, and we were going to, somebody from a place called Incomes Data Services had come to Paul with this new phenomena called share options. And we sat in front of this, by this time we'd got computers, which was quite an innovation. And we sat in front of this computer. We didn't have them in our office. We had to go down on the subs floor. And he sat there and began typing this story because we had to explain to a Daily Mirror audience, this is a working class audience, what a share option is. And he must have rewritten the opening paragraph 4 or 5 times. He began until he got it right. And then we ran the rest of the story, and then he went back and he rewrote it at least twice. You know, he just kept fiddling with it until he'd got it absolutely right to explain what a share option was. So even though he could write just like that, it bothered him. You know, it bothered him in his mind. Is this story good enough? Is my audience going to understand this story in the way that I've written it? And I have a comment in the book from Ian Hislop. He said, I'll have to just read it to you because I don't want to not quote Ian Hislop properly. He said he wrote news like it was fiction. Everything was story. And I think that's, of all the things I can emphasize, you have to tell stories. And Paul just was brilliant at telling stories. Everything was story.
There's one of the other things that it strikes me from the book is how many times he's working in partnership with other journalists, right? Because the interesting thing to me, he was a really competitive person. There's no doubt about that. I mean, he was a delight, obviously. He was a friend of mine, but he was a delight to be with. I never had a dull time with Paul, but he was immensely competitive professionally. And yet, at the same time, again and again in your book, you have examples of how he works in partnership with some other journalists, often a specialist journalist or somebody who's only on the fringes of journalism. And again, I thought that was, in terms of, I just think, the great thing about this book is it is like a handbook of how to do this job. I mean, that's the reason why you should all be buying it, by the way, and why it'll be, sold for many, many years to come, I think. And how much did you notice that because obviously, in a way, although you knew him well and worked with him, the writing of the book, you discover an enormous, and you codify it and you distill it into something else.
It is slightly weird writing a book about someone you know, because there's the Paul I know, and then there's Paul I wrote the book about, and they're slightly different people. But I do remember one occasion in the office, I can't remember the story, but Richard Norton Taylor had been working with Paul on something.
You might need to explain who he is to some of the people here.
So Richard Norton Taylor,
the security correspondent of the Guardian. Yeah.
So I suspect this might have been the Gibraltar shootings or something, or a Northern Ireland story or something like that. Chat. Then the phone call, and I happened to be in the room, and Paul says, I hope he's not going to publish that story before I do. I mean, he was absolutely raging that he'd been having this perfectly amenable, but he was really worried that Richard Norton Taylor was going to pip him to the post. So Paul would then, so in the early part of in his early career, when he's on Private Eye, there's 2 stories I do there. One is where he does the Christian Barnard heart surgeon story. And a heart surgeon then gets in touch with him. And I interviewed this guy, and he said, I wasn't there for the first story. The first story was amazing, but then I wrote to him at Private Eye, and so then he talks to Paul on the subsequent stories that he writes. And so Paul has, an expert then on hand. Another one is when he's doing the collapse of Ronan Point. And the collapse of Ronan Point, which was a tower block in East London, and there'd been this whole scandalous story that had gone on for years, and went on for years, because in order to put up a lot of cheap council housing, a lot of councils had adopted this particular form of building where you brought in the concrete slabs and you put it up like a pack of cards. And of course, if there was a gas explosion, it collapsed like a pack of cards, and that's what happened at Ronan Point. And Paul had then, didn't know, but there was a guy called Sam Webb who was an architect. who'd been looking at this. And so then he worked with Sam Webb on the miscarriage cases. He actually, the other thing you have to know about Paul is he wrote books. So all of this journalism is going on. He's also churning out books at the same time at an amazing rate. So a number of the books are about miscarriages of justice. The Bridgewater book, the first person to write to him is Anne Whelan, who is Michael Hickey's mother. She lives in a council flat. She has no money. She knows her son didn't do this murder, or she believes it, as Paul says, what mother wouldn't say. But she really worked at it. And then when it came to the point where he was going to write the book, he goes to her flat. He actually writes the book in her flat, well, the bulk of the book in her flat, because she's got all the papers and she knows she can put her hand on anything he wants. Colin Wallace says exactly the same thing about the book Paul wrote about his case.
Colin Wallace, for those of you who don't work for the British Army in Northern Ireland, he was basically, his job was propaganda and putting out complete misinformation about what was going on in Northern Ireland. He left and he was then framed for manslaughter. Yeah. And was definitely falls into this sort of the loony on the phone to start with. Paul, I remember, was very cautious about getting involved.
Well, he said, you know...
Anyway, he gets involved. He comes out of prison. He goes to prison. Wallace, he comes out determined to demonstrate that he did not commit, that he was not guilty of manslaughter. Sorry, yeah. That's who Colin Wallace is.
And Paul writes about Colin Wallace in the Daily Mirror, and then realises it's a complicated story, and he's going to have to write a book about it. And they have to write the book at incredible speed in the end, because Margaret Thatcher's government was introducing a new Secrets Act, and if the book isn't published before the Act comes out, it's not going to get published at all. So Paul literally speed writes this book. And Colin says, you know, he knew where every piece of paper was. There were piles of paper all over the floor, and he could always find one. So he works with Colin on writing this book. He works with Jim Nichol, a lawyer who he'd known. I mean, it was Jim Nichol who'd recruited him to work for Socialist Worker. And they worked, and then became a lawyer, and they worked together on a number. There's far more miscarriage of justice cases than I even mention in this book. And they worked together on those. When it comes to the Lockerbie case, you know, the plane that's blown up in the sky over Lockerbie, the Pan Am flight, blown up, there were big questions about whether or not the Libyans were ever involved. And Paul pursued that story, particularly working with a number of the families who'd lost children in that bombing. Jim Swire, but in particular Pam Dix, whose brother died in the flight, on that flight. And when he came, he wrote a special for Private Eye about the Lockerbie bombing. And Pam, I mean, literally was his researcher. And so he would often find someone who could help him and work with him. And you got your name in the small print. But I mean, he was always generous to the people.
Yes,
I mean, there was no money in it, but he was always generous in sharing.
Yeah, that comes across, you know, very strongly as his sort of methodology. Now, you've mentioned quite a few of sort of his triumphs, but I obviously am going to ask you about the Hanratty case. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this case, a man called James Hanratty was charged with murdering two people in a car on the A6 road. That was known as the A6 murder. And he always protested his innocence. Paul campaigned over a long period of time, and he was executed. He was one of the last people in Britain to be executed for murder. It was after the execution his family came to see Paul, and Paul took up the case and worked on it for a long period of time, wrote a brilliant and moving book about it. And then subsequently, years later, DNA testing showed that James Hanratty was indeed the murderer. Now, and Paul, well, go on. I'm just giving you the context so you can talk about it.
So the context at the start, in the 1960s, James Hanratty, capital punishment is still operating in this country until 1965, but James Hanratty is, can't think of the right word. Anyway, he's killed before the law changes.
And it was a big case at the time because we sort of campaigned, those of us who were against capital punishment, this was always one of the cases.
Well, that was. So it becomes a part of, so it becomes a sort of iconic conviction
exactly.
because of this huge campaign that's taking place against capital punishment, and then the Labour government comes in 64 and in 65 suspends capital punishment for 5 years. And Paul gets involved in the case and gets to know James Hanratty's father, who's also called James, we call him Jim Hanratty because it distinguishes the two of them, and James Hanratty's brother Michael, and his mother Mary. And he gets involved in what is a campaign, partly for, and at the outset, it's not for James Hanratty's innocence, it's for an inquiry into what had happened. And in the context of this campaign against capital punishment. And I think a number of things happen, but the most important one is that Paul gets very, very close to the Hanratty family. I mean, really close. And his commitment is as much to them and their desire to have their son exonerated of this murder. And that, I think, becomes an issue at the end. But he's not the only one working on this story. The BBC is working on the story.
Panorama did a big piece.
And they find, because Hanratty claims an alibi, that he's not in London, he's not in Bedford committing this crime, he's in Liverpool and Rhyl. And they find all sorts of people. I mean, there are one or two people at the trial who give evidence on this. Some evidence that would have helped the defence at the trial is not released by the police or the prosecution, which is, not how it should be, but that happens in lots and lots of cases. And so Paul gets involved in trying to firm up this story about the alibi, and he becomes very, very committed to the real alibi. And so this, but the alibi is not accepted at the trial, and Valerie Story, who survives the attempted murder, says that identifies Hanratty as the person who rapes her. So it's a horrible, horrible story, a horrible murder and rape, and a long and complicated and convoluted investigation. Paul writes a book. All of Paul's books, Hanratty, Helen Smith, Colin Wallace, Bridgewater, the whole lot, they read like novels. I mean, they're pacey. And he's totally committed. Now, in the 1960s, there was no such thing as DNA evidence. Just didn't exist. It wasn't even on the radar screen. By the time the case comes back for its final appeal, the grounds of appeal are going to be on questions of law, and then the prosecution say they've extracted DNA from this tiny sample of Valerie Story's knickers that have been kept. And the DNA test shows that Hanratty had actually committed the rape, and if he committed the rape, he committed the murder. And Paul could not accept that outcome. What actually happened, I mean, his view was that that material must have been contaminated. I had a long conversation with one of the barristers involved who said that really didn't stand up, and that the way he put it, and the way I put it in the book, is this: Paul always said he always relied on the real alibi and therefore couldn't accept the DNA evidence. But if the DNA evidence was right, then there was something wrong, profoundly wrong, with the real alibi. But Paul couldn't accept that. And I think he couldn't accept it, even though it would be rational to accept it, because he had made such a deep and lasting commitment to the Hanratty family. Paul was loyal. And I think that loyalty, in the end, blinded him to what was probably, the correct outcome.
One of the other things that I wanted to ask you about, and put to you really, is that there's two dimensions to this. Could there be a Paul Foot today? And it partly, and would he have been Paul Foot if he hadn't been from the Foot dynasty? I mean, it is very, very striking that, I mean, you mentioned his first job was on a paper in Glasgow, but he did get it by writing a letter to the chairman of the company that owned it. And he did get his next job, his first job on national newspapers in the Sunday Telegraph, on the Sunday Telegraph, Daily Telegraph, or Sunday Telegraph rather, by doing the same thing. Yeah. I mean, he was an immensely well-connected person. And, and as you said, the people he'd met at Shrewsbury and he then met again at Oxford, including Richard Ingram's, this was the network that really enabled him, to achieve an enormous amount. And I am sure he wouldn't have been on any questions and if he hadn't been a member of the Foot dynasty. Right now, he is brilliant. He's a brilliant speaker. He's very entertaining. So that's my first question. Was the name itself something that was easy, made it easier for him? I'm not taking away from his unbelievable energy, commitment, and all of that sort of thing. And the second thing is it conceivable now one could have somebody of this sort, with space, guaranteed space, every week of their own, and also producing this stream of books. We haven't even talked about his books about Shelley, for example, or his 3 books that he wrote about British politics before he even started any of the journalism books. So can you imagine? Those are the two questions. Would he have got there if he hadn't been called Foot? And secondly, could there be a Paul Foot today?
I think if he hadn't been called Foot, he would have found a way, because he would have teamed up with Richard Ingram's and the others and got into private eye at the outset, and he would have made his name that way, because he was incredibly clever and incredibly good at what he did. But there is no doubt, I mean, the thing you have to understand about the Foots is, I mean, it's a political name in the 1960s, and the 1960s is a very different era from now. I mean, the country was in a certain amount of ferment, I mean, in a positive way from some points of view. But the other thing about Paul is you have to accept, and we've talked about this, you have to accept the whole package. And the whole package includes his radical politics. And what he says, not about his politics, about being a journalist, because Paul never called himself an investigative journalist, ever. He always thought he was doing what all journalists should do, asking questions. And he says, really, to be a good journalist, you have to be curious and you have to be skeptical. But also, you've got to have, I think, and he certainly thought, you've got to have a view of the world. You've got to have some understanding. And I'll give you an example. You've got to have some understanding of the forces at play in society, because you've got to know who's pulling the strings, where the money is coming from, who's running it. And there was a little piece in The Guardian this morning, lobbyists seconded to Labour to help shape policy. A headline that would have Paul in fits of fury, and which he would follow up, not by asking, oh, who are all these lobbyists? He'd be asking, what are these lobbyist politics? Who are these people politically? What political strings are being pulled here? He did a piece, because when I saw that headline, I went and printed, I mean, you can't see it. This is a piece he wrote in private. It's a diagram of all, he calls them Whigs, but these are all the people who are not in the Labour Party, they're in the SDP, or which is what the Social Democrat, these are the right wing who left the party, the Labour Party in the early 80s. And these people are all in the SDP, which incorporates the Liberals. So none of these people are either in the party that's been, none of these people have been elected, and none of them are in the party that's been elected, but they've become really significant players in the Labour government elected in 1997. And many of them run consultancies. So Paul's interested in the lobbyists, but he's interested in the politics of the lobbyists and where they're all coming from, because these consultancies dictate. What was the question?
Well, the second question is, you answered the first one. He would have found a way, even if he had been called Smith, not Foot, right? The second question, and that but you were making a point answering the question that the politics is at the heart of his journalism. It is a political, and that's why your book is called A Life in Politics. So, finally then, as you've just said, don't give up, right? You know, I've got the last book he wrote, which was obviously published after he died. And the last 2 pages of this book, with which you are obviously immensely familiar, does imply that his belief in revolutionary socialism he was questioning that, and he was not sure whether he was right on that. Do you think that judgment is correct?
I don't think he quite says that in that last quote. What he says is, I was always a revolutionary. I mean, he doesn't say it like this. I've always believed in revolutionary socialism and revolutionary change. And I don't know, and I've always questioned whether or not I was right or not. And so he was expressing his self-doubt, but he also, as I say, travelled in hope and optimism. And you do see sparks of it occasionally, and you do see sparks of it in different countries at different times. And you do see it even in this country at different times. I think there are a lot of young people now who are extremely fed up with the political smorgasbord that's currently on offer. I think Jeremy Corbyn sort of touched some of that in 2015 and 17. 2017, the election that nobody ever mentions. It does not exist. You will not find it referred to in The Guardian, or the Sunday Times, or the Observer, or anywhere. It just doesn't exist. But a lot of young people were engaged in a moment. And we had that in bucket loads between 1968 and 1972, 74. And then we had it in Portugal, and we have it, you know. The rich are incredibly greedy, the way they run the world in their own interest. And Paul thought that has to change. And, you know, the question is how that change and the circumstances in which any such change could come about. So I don't think he doubted his broader analysis. I think what he doubted was whether or not, well, I mean, he certainly doubted whether or not it would happen in his lifetime. And he maybe doubted when it might happen. I don't think he doubted that change would come, because there is an inherent doom loop, you know, written into the way the world is run. I mean, either, you know, climate change is, you know, they're battling some huge storm in Jamaica and people are dying because they've got no water in parts of Africa. You can't go on like that. You can't go on with forever wars. You can't go on wondering whether somebody's going to press the nuclear button or not. And, you know, the current crop of politicians, certainly in this country, don't seem to have any answers. So I don't know where the pressure points are. You never know. And that's why you have to travel in optimism and hope. And that's why you have to keep on with all the investigative journalism and find the outlets you can. And the more adept you are at finding different outlets, the better it will be.
Thank you. Buy the book.